Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait another minute to let people come into the Zoom room. In the meantime, if you want to drop where you're coming from in the chat, we would love to hear it.
We have one audience member joining from Andover. That's where our speaker also is tonight.
And I see a few people from our hometown in the Triangle region of North Carolina, which is nice.
And our friends in Canada, always so loyal. And I see our next speaker there too. Hi, Catherine.
All right, well, welcome back everyone to Jane Austen and Company. My name is Anne Ferdig, and I am a PhD in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as the co-director of Jane Austen and Company. We are delighted to see everyone here for the penultimate event in our latest series, Asia and the Regency. And tonight we welcome award-winning author Karen Tei Yamashita, author of the book of short stories, Sansei and Sensibility, which you will be discussing with us tonight. For those of you joining us for the first time tonight, Jane Austen and Company is a free public humanities series hosted by the Jane Austen Summer Program. Our mission is to bring free events and workshops on Jane Austen and her broader global context to audiences around the world. Today, I'm joined by my co-hosts, Dr. Inga Brody and Dr. Kimio Ogawa, as well as our technical director, Jared Powell. And now I'm going to hand things off to Inga to talk a little bit more about what this series means.
Hi, everyone. I'm a professor in the same department as Anne and Jared at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and also in the Asian Studies and Global Studies departments. I co-founded and direct the Jane Austen Summer Program, which is the parent organization for Jane Austen and Company. I did want to make a special announcement today because Anne is now Dr. Fertig as of this week, successfully completed her PhD. So just wanted to make sure everybody knew that.
Thank you.
And we are nearing the conclusion of our third series with Jane Austen Company. Our first COVID-inspired series was Staying Home with Jane Austen, exploring the role of various domestic arts in the Regency. This was followed by our series Race in the Regency, which took interdisciplinary approaches to the experience and representation of race, primarily in relation to slavery and abolition. And each event in these two series attracted hundreds of visitors from around the world, as this series has done as well. And collaborating with Kimio, we're now in our 10th installment of Asia and the Regency. One more to go, as Anne mentioned. And we would like to ask your opinion about what you'd like to hear for what topic we should tackle for our next series. Jared has a poll about 2 ideas that we've thought of. And Anne, I don't know if you want to jump in and say a little bit.
Yeah, so we have 2 ideas that we are deciding for our next series. The first is Everyday Science in the Regency, which will talk about everything from the developments in transportation in the time period, such as carriages and ships, to book production and medicine in the period, looking at the practical technologies that informed people's everyday lives. And then our second idea is Authors Austen Read, going back to the original inspiration behind Jane Austen and Company, which was to read female authors contemporaneous with Jane Austen. In this series, we would look at authors that Austen herself read and enjoyed. So if you want to have an opinion on our next series, please feel free to drop it in the poll or email us your ideas. We are always excited and eager to hear what our audience has to say. Asia and the Regency was actually sparked by audience feedback. So your voice absolutely has a say in what we do.
Yes, and for this particular series, we were really grateful for Kimio and her co-editor of a new book forthcoming on Austen and Asia. So Kimio gave us lots of ideas for what to include. And I would like to turn it over to Professor Kimio Ogawa of Sophia University in Japan, who will introduce our speaker. I think you might be muted. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Yep.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Inga. Right. Karen Tei Yamashita is the author of 8 books, including I Hotel, finalist for the National Book Award. Her most recent book, Sansei and Sensibility. I mean, for a moment I thought Sensei, sense, all very confusing, but that makes it much, even more attractive. This book, especially the second part, connects the plots of Jane Austen to Japanese American life, which reaches across time, culture, country, enabling us readers to explore imaginatively what it was like to live in a tightly knit provincial Japanese American community and to grow up as a Japanese American. These books are all published by Coffee House Press. I have read Sansei and Sensibility, and it is a very, very enjoyable read, especially if you're a Janeite, and like me, if you have traveled both Japan and America. It's an exciting read, truly recommended. I mean, very, very good book. She's recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award for distinguished contribution to American letters from the National Book Foundation. And she's the 34th recipient of this award. I just want to say that this is a very prestigious award. Previous recipients include, for example, John Ashbery, Stephen King, Ursula Le Guin, Norman Mailer, Toni Morrison, to name a few. Other than this award, she's been awarded the John Dos Passos Prize for Literature and a US Artist Ford Foundation Fellowship. She's a professor emerita of literature and creative writing at the University of California, Santa Cruz. We're very honored to have her with us today. But before we hear from Karen, we need a few words of instruction from our technical director, Jared Powell. Jared?
Yes, thank you, Kimio. So I'm just going to take a moment to explain how tonight's event will work. So the event will last about 90 minutes in total, including Q&A. And so throughout and after the presentation, you're welcome to put questions for our speaker into the Q&A box. And let me share my screen really quickly to show you this presentation. So yes, questions for the speaker to be answered at Q&A at the end of the talk. You hit the little Q&A icon on the bottom bar of your Zoom window. And then when we get to the Q&A portion, Kimio, Inga, and Anne will take turns asking them. And then if you would like to chat with other attendees, as many of you have already been doing and figured that out, you do that in the chat. Just you want to make sure that this little drop-down menu here is set to everyone. It might default to hosts and panelists, and then only we would see it, but we want everyone to see it. So questions for our speaker in the Q&A, comments and conversation with other attendees in the chat. And speaking of the chat, we usually enjoy quite a robust chat, but if you want to hide that chat in the notifications, some audience members find that a bit distracting. I've got a walkthrough of how to do that. So if you're on a Windows PC, you will click that chat icon and the chat should pop up in a separate little window here, which you will just click at the top of that window and drag it off screen. If you're on Mac, it's a similar process, just one extra step. You click the chat icon. Instead of popping out in a separate window, it tends to be just a sidebar. So then you click that drop-down menu and then select pop out there. And then from there, it's the same. You click the top border here and drag it off screen. And then finally, if you're joining us on a tablet, such as an iPad, again, you start with that chat icon and then the bell, the notifications icon, and then mute. So, and then as usual, if you have other technical difficulties, I'll be keeping my eye on the chat throughout the presentation to help you out. So feel free to just say, help, reach out in the chat, and I'll be in touch. And then again, I do want to also give a reminder, if anyone has joined since we first announced this, I do have that poll live where you can cast your vote for our next Jane Austen and Company series topics. That will be live throughout the remainder of the talk. Again, that should be as a little poll icon on that bottom bar as well. Thank you. And I think we're back to Anne.
Thank you, Jared. And it is so nice to see that so many of you have responded already. It's nice to see such an enthusiastic response. Do note that tonight's program will be recorded. These are usually available on our website about a week or two afterwards. So if for whatever reason, if your internet cuts out, no worries, you can always watch it later. And without further ado, I would like to hand things over to Karen Tei Yamashita.
Thank you. So I guess I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I can do this correctly. Here we go. There we go. Thank you, Anne Fertig, Inga Brody, and Kimio Ogawa. Thank you for hosting this event. And thank you to Jane Austen and Company. Also, thank you to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm very honored to be here and a little scared, actually. But thank you so much for inviting me. Let's see. Oh, wait. Okay, here we go. I have to get used to doing this. First of all, an explanation about the title. It's Sansei and Sensibility. As you see, sense has been replaced by Sensei. Okay, so to be clear, it's not Sensei, okay, which means teacher, but Sensei, which means third generation Japanese immigrant descendant. If you know how to count in Japanese, you can follow the numeric logic, ichi, ni, san, shi, and of course, san, or third. And I don't know if we'll ever get to nanase or hase, I doubt it, or even kyusei. Okay, somewhere in the middle of the book, you can find a timeline in which you will know that the Nisei were the greatest generation and the Sansei are boomers. In case you are wondering about the dates, my writer friend and bona fide Sansei, Naomi Hirohara, miraculously fact-checked everything. And so we try to give you here dates, which give you a historic background to the timeline of immigration of Japanese to the United States, and in particular, with particular emphasis on the place that I grew up in, which is Southern California, and then to talk about generational differences. Now, this book came about not because I had read or knew anything about Jane Austen or her novels or the time period of her writing. Everything I knew about Jane Austen was because my sister, this woman, Jane told me, who is not only named Jane, but a Janeite, or the Janeite in our family. And everything I gleaned about Jane Austen was by a kind of osmosis. Watching movies together, and watching my sister plan and sew her Regency gowns. Following also her involvement in Jane Austen conferences and meetings. And being forced to vote for Pride and Prejudice for the PBS Great American Top 100 Reads. If I recall, we were asked to vote often and as many times as we liked and every day. And I don't know what you think, but there's something fishy about that. Considering that I taught literature and I was a literature major, not having read Jane Austen sounds pretty dumb. As I explain, or rather apologize in the book, it was about time to read Jane Austen. I bought the big book, the complete novels of Jane Austen with an introduction by Karen Joy Fowler. Now, Karen Joy is a friend and a writer who taught for us at UC Santa Cruz and who also lives in Santa Cruz. And Karen Joy is known for her science fiction and speculative fiction writing. If Karen Joy could write science fiction and read Jane Austen, I realized I was really missing out. And besides, reading Jane Austen could also be a bonding thing with my sister. In reading Austen's novels, I was trying, I think, to understand my sister, to find out why she loved reading these novels and how she could read them over and over again, and then go on to reading everything about them, historic and academic, social and cultural, plus every sort of fan fiction based on these novels. Okay, I admit I was a bit jealous, but why this obsession? So this is what I discovered. Jane Austen has a biting tongue. Regency dress is intoxicating. Class difference is sexy and the spice of romance. Being rich is a handsome problem. Sexual partnership, AKA sometimes marriage, is the unresolved feminist conundrum. And finally, people of color too want to go to the ball. So originally I created this keynote for the Jane Austen Society. And when invited through my sister to give this talk, you can imagine the complexity of my feelings. Triumph, finally I get in the club. Embarrassment, good grief, I'm a fake. And finally, anxiety, what could I possibly have to say to real Janeites? But true, I needed to come clean, to take responsibility for writing this book, even though I mostly blame it on my sister. I finally came to think that this event would be a good opportunity. Let me explain. This book is divided into two parts. Part one, Sensei, is a collection of previously published short stories and essays. Part two, Sensibility, is a collection of stories based on Jane Austen's novels, one story for each novel. Up until this point, I'd been giving readings and lectures of the first half of this book. Now, finally, I could talk to an understanding audience more freely about the second half. As I read Austen's novels, one by one, I began to think about and to remember my sister and me growing up Sansei, or third generation Japanese American, in Los Angeles, Southern California. I thought about this because Austen's descriptions of society are enclosed and tightly knit, where everyone knows and gossips over the business of others, where slight differences are always noticed, where smart kids go to hide from notice in books. The closed community and social network in which we grew up could be stifling and provincial, but also safe. But there are reasons for why it existed. So I'm going to read from an essay I wrote for Guernica magazine, and I'll read the first few paragraphs. My sister and I grew up in a series of Japanese American bubbles in the 1950s and 60s that shaped our Sansei lives in Los Angeles from elementary to high school, each bubble bursting into another. By bubble, I mean a protective community space of Japanese Americans who didn't have to explain to each other who they were and how they got there. They didn't have to explain the war, that they'd been imprisoned in camps, exiled non-alien citizens, had returned to the West Coast to try to resume their American lives. The bubble was never an easy space. Its safe containment also harbored shame, antagonisms, censures, provincialism, but it was still home. We stayed in this bubble even as we moved through 3 LA neighborhoods confined by racial covenants at the margins of post-war social mobility. Fifth Avenue, Los Angeles. In 1952, my parents were a young couple with a 1-year-old baby, me. Arriving from Oakland, California, my father called to pastor the Japanese American Centenary Methodist Church near Normandy and Jefferson Boulevard in central Los Angeles. That church, founded in 1896, became in the post-war years part of a social safety net for returning Japanese. My parents moved into the church parsonage, located about 1.5 miles from the church on Fifth Avenue. The following year, my sister was born. The church and the Fifth Avenue parsonage were the center around which our early lives radiated. The surrounding neighborhood was home to mostly African-American and Japanese-American families. It was a part of a mid-drift swath of LA that extended from Boyle Heights through downtown and Little Tokyo, crossing USC, or the University of Southern California, traveling down Jefferson Boulevard and abutting itself against the Baldwin Hills. It was where we were allowed to live and to buy homes. It was where the Japanese community and young Nisei families returned to jumpstart their lives. Of this racial geography, my sister and I had no idea. So I began to think about social similarities between Jane Austen's community and ours. Of course, the society Jane Austen describes is comparatively very wealthy, and we lived in the urban inner city of working and middle-class folks. But in each Austen novel, there were encounters that I could draw from that felt familiar. Maybe I thought if I could remember the way we were in those days, I could figure out the meaning of Jane Austen to my sister. And I could also add a missing element in Austen's novels, race. I thought I would share with you what I learned and how I wrote each story. Oh, no, don't do that. Okay, here we go. Here's the cheat sheet. cheat sheet. Can you see that? Okay. So first off, here's the cheat sheet. And what I want to do is share with you the intersections of Jane Austen's world with our Sansei world of post-war Japanese American communities in Southern California. Each of these stories begins with the Japanese evocation, mukashi mukashi, meaning in former times or a long time ago, or to invoke an old folktale, once upon a time. Okay, we Sansei are not that old, but if you got the COVID vaccine, well, I've got it 4 times already. So chances are you're probably over 65. Okay, this doesn't apply to anybody, but anyway. So you, like my grandkids, think that's old. Well, I think there must be older people in this audience. So anyway. Okay. So let's begin with Sense and Sensibility, or my version, shikata ga nai or mottai nai. In the Japanese or community in our day, some of the most successful and prominent people were the optometrists. You figure that Japanese all have bad eyes, so it's a win-win situation. A lot of bad eyes and excellent optometrists. In my story, the Dashwood family are the Dashimoris, and Dr. John Dashimori Jr. is a successful optometrist. He is married to Fan, and his 2 dependent high school sisters are Eleanor and Marianne Dashimori. In tune with Austen's Sense and Sensibility, I thought about keywords that Japanese Americans are familiar with that mark our social attitudes. Shikata ga nai and mottai nai. Shikata ga nai means literally, it can't be helped. Something like, don't cry over spilled milk. In other words, in an impossible situation, forget it and move on. Mottai nai means don't waste. To take care and to make use of, or to finish everything, to scrape up the last bits at the bottom of a jar. These phrases became significant when Japanese Americans on the Pacific coast were sent away to internment camps to be imprisoned as citizen enemies during World War II. Shikata ga nai, it couldn't be helped. Move on with our lives, but also how to make use of lives lost and lost time. Mottai nai, what a waste. However you read these stories as based in Austen's plots and characters, central to my telling is the post-war, the return of Japanese Americans to the West Coast from internment camps and the war, and the desire of the Nisei generation to start their lives over again as Americans. I asked my niece, Lucy Asako Bowles, my sister's daughter, and this is truly a family event, to create some cartoons for this presentation based on her reading of these stories. So this story begins, mukashi mukashi, as they used to say, in our little world of tea houses and dainty gardens of pine, bonsai, and azalea. Dappled in puffy mounds of lime green dichondra, lacquered bridges, serene ponds of fat polka dot, koi resting in the shadows of water lilies, leaning red, purple, maple, and purple wisteria, the click-clack of bamboo on rock, the clatter of geta over wood, and the swishing of silk were the happy undertones of the chatter of the 2 Sansei sisters who appeared on the bridge to scatter round pellets of koi food from a small hand-woven basket. A flutter of banana yellow butterflies seemed to swirl from their bright kimono and scatter over the pond. Then suddenly a gigantic white koi broke the surface, its large albino lips and gullet open and flaring, and handily gulped down the largest of the butterflies, though perhaps only the impudent size of a baby canary. The sisters watched the delicate wings fold and crush, and the koi's pink eye blink and disappear. Oh, said Mary Ann, the younger of the two Dashimori sisters. You've seen it for yourself. He's done it again. She pouted and banged her geta into the bridge, the sudden noise sending the koi below to scatter. I'm telling John tonight to catch that old monster and serve him up for sashimi. Moving on, Pride and Prejudice, or my version, Gidi and Gaman. The big deal about Pride and Prejudice is, well, Mr. Darcy. But my reading of Mr. Darcy is that he doesn't say anything for pages and pages, and then finally, when pushed to declare his love, speaks for paragraphs. We only know Darcy from his slights and silence. But then I thought about all those cute Sansei guys who were socially inept, inarticulate, boring, and hopelessly shy. But secretly, these guys were amazing and powerful. They were samurai and kung fu masters. Once again, in keeping with Austen's title, Pride and Prejudice, I chose two words in the Japanese American lexicon that want to define or self-define us. Again, these words are attached to wartime internment, to ideas of duty, to family and country, and the will to persevere during difficult times. But just as Austen complicates in her storytelling the ideas of pride and prejudice by speaking through the lives of young women, I here too want to complicate the ideas of duty and perseverance, as young women are called to active citizenship. As you know, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution guarantees the equal rights of all persons in America. However, wartime imprisonment without due process of law deprived these children of their life and liberty. A few other bits of information in my version of Pride and Prejudice. It's set in a public high school in the 1960s. The Benihana daughters all attend this high school. Mrs. Benihana is president of the PTA. Miss Borg is the high school principal, and the school librarian is Mr. Collins. On the night of the prom, Mr. Benihana came up from his basement to find his wife and daughters in a titter of pastel chiffon and satin, nylons, pointed heels, hairspray. He greeted each of the young men, all awkward in their stiff suits and ties, who came to take his daughters away. When everyone seemed to have disappeared and left the house in peaceful calm, Mr. Benihana saw Lizzie on the sofa with a book. What are you doing here? What about that Darcy kid whose dad is always talking about serving in the 442nd? He took his sister to the prom. Oh yeah? Mr. Benihana seemed to think about this, but said nothing. Hey, let's go to a movie, he offered. I heard about it on the radio. The Graduate sounds real, he added, looking at the tossed book on the sofa. Forget Salinger. This might be obvious. Monterey Park stands for Mansfield Park. In the 1960s and 70s, well-to-do Chinese Americans, many relocating from Hong Kong, were able to afford nice houses and businesses in Monterey Park. The folks in Monterey Park weren't too happy about this and tried to pass an English-only law for signage, and I guess it never worked out. I suppose you could say that Monterey Park got gentrified by well-to-do Chinese, and it seemed like a prosperous place to locate the Wuya Wada family, their 4 children, their pugs, and their poor relative, Fanny Rice. That's right. Not Price, Rice. But it's a bad joke. One other thing, I decided to switch roles to make the mother, Tammy Wuya, a formidable figure and a tiger mother who has absolute notions of control over her children, their education and future. Guaranteed, Fanny Rice will be a star. One thing about Monterey Park and its relationship to Mansfield Park, and I can't resist this because in the beginning, the only thing I'd read about Jane Austen was Edward Said's essay about Thomas Burton's plantation holdings in Antigua. In my version, the tiger mother, Tammy Wuya, is a Chinese entrepreneur who has made her great fortune exploiting Filipino laborers who make plastic toys and Bic lighters that sell like hotcakes during the Vietnam War to American GIs in her factory in the Philippines. Tammy wandered into her house, which had been transformed by low lighting, rotating strobes, and lava lamps, and meandered through crowds of girls with thick makeup, exposed bosoms, and martini glasses, posturing haughtily and moving lasciviously to the live music pumping from the rock band playing on a platform on the far side of the pool. She could see Eddie on guitar, random other kids on drums and bass, and Mary belting vocals into a handheld microphone, modulated through a sound system Harry controlled on the other side. And through the glass doors, Tommy, dressed like Dracula, was lit up on an inside stage, placing a pug in a black box and tapping it with his magic wand. Fanny, looking up from the keyboards, was the first to see Tammy. Julie was barefoot, dancing precariously on the diving board over the deep end. And when Tammy screamed her recognizable scream, the shock tossed Julie into the pool. Splash. That, Fanny would remember, was the beginning of the end. The final blow to Tammy was to find Mariko in the garage in the middle of an intense cheering crowd, presiding over a table of blackjack. Emma, for me, was my favorite read. Emma is, I think, a character study, and what the reader follows is her growth as a person. I read Emma as free-spirited, generously enthusiastic, bright, and charmingly naive. My Emma is Emi Moriuchi. In case you are wondering, Mr. Knightley, older and more discerning, is in my story, George Kishi. As it turns out, Emmy was born in Manzanar, the internment camp in the southeastern side of California under the Sierra Nevada. But this is a secret never revealed to her until she is a teenager. In other words, Emmy has no knowledge of her past and the wartime internment of Japanese Americans. I think this was generally true of many Sansei, that the Nisei, our parents' generation, kept the knowledge of the war from their children to protect us from that stigma. It is from this knowledge that Emmy becomes gradually more aware and more politically involved. All Harriet ever talked about was guys. So Emmy suggested she might expand her horizons, that is, come to meetings. Emmy pulled a sheet of cookies from the oven, shoved a spatula over a soft cookie, and listened. You know Bob? Harriet asked. Oh, Bob Torrey? Right. He asked me to marry him. Oh, well, congratulations. Emmy frowned at one cookie that had folded itself over. But I thought we were working on Phil or Frank. I haven't said yes or no yet. Harriet stuffed a warm cookie into her mouth and muttered through the dough. What do you think? You have doubts? I mean, why ask me? I'm never getting married. Never? Then Emmy said, let me ask you this. What are Bob's politics? In her coming of age, what Emmy learns about is a long history of anti-Asian immigration policies and laws from the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 and on, all fueled by racism and hate, which are used as precedents to justify the incarceration of honest and hardworking immigrant families. By Emmy's time in 1982, 100 years later, a young man named Vincent Chin was bludgeoned to death in Detroit, blamed for the layoffs of American auto workers because of competition from Japanese car makers. Today, 39 years, or it's more than that, more than 40 years later, sadly, we again see the same evil face of racist hate and blaming. I believe the turning point in Emma is the scene in which Emma openly ridicules Miss Bates. Similarly, my character, Emmy, brings her cohort of Sansei radicals to a church event to rebelliously denounce their parents' generation for their complicity in their own incarceration. My Miss Bates is Mrs. Essa, who hosts the church event to painful embarrassment. So I thought you'd like to see, I'd also thought that you'd like to see the fierce Sansei women of that day. I paint Emmy as a pretty, sweet woman, but really, we were a pretty rude bunch. Northanger Abbey is next, and I got caught up in the idea of the Gothic in Northanger Abbey. I began to remember the Goth moment in American culture, youth culture. And as it turns out, in Little Tokyo, there used to be a restaurant called the Atomic Cafe, named to remember the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Atomic Cafe was opened in the post-war by Minoru and Ito Matoba. It was a diner serving hamburgers, noodles, egg foo young, and chop suey. In the late 80s, when Minoru became ill, his daughter Nancy took over the cafe, and she started dressing in punk, put up punk posters, and played punk music, and thus attracted a new crowd of youth. The Atomic Cafe was filled with punk kids in mohawks, piercings, safety pin earrings, and nose rings, black lipstick, so forth. It was said that the Go-Go's, David Byrne and Sid Vicious, came to Atomic Cafe to slurp chashu ramen. And Nancy was known in the day as Atomic Nancy, the kabuki punk girl. So that is the fictional setting of my Northanger Abbey, Japanese American Gothic. Kathy's eyes traversed the Hiroshima hostess, Bella, who sported a red hobby coat over a leather skirt with fishnets. Her hair ratted in every direction. Bella shook her finger at Mrs. Ishii, too many sweets. Mrs. Ishii nodded back and forth like it was her fault. Bella, this is Kathy. Bella took a step back and glared appropriately through mascara and thick eyeliner, moist red lips, articulating, how do you do? Emphasizing the do's. Kathy stumbled. Bella turned and left the table, yelling over the counter into the kitchen. Mama, guess who's here? A few more things about this Japanese American Goth story. The three fathers in the story, Katsunoda, the general, Tosh Ozawa, Kathy's father, and Min Murata, the dying owner of the Hiroshima Cafe, were all Kibe. Kibe means they were born in the United States, but sent to Japan to be educated. They were therefore bilingual and biculturally Japanese and American. Their personal story is that the three men were childhood friends going to school in Hiroshima, but returning to the United States, war broke out. Min Murata left California for Montana to avoid incarceration. Katsunoda and Tosh Ozawa were incarcerated with other Japanese Americans as enemy non-aliens. But their friendship ended because of their different answers to the loyalty questionnaire. All imprisoned Japanese in camp were required to answer this questionnaire. I don't know if you can see it. I can't see the whole thing right here. There's a loyalty question, okay. It would determine if you could leave work to work outside of camp and or if you could serve in the United States military. While many of the questions seemed innocuous or about contact with Japan and its traditions, two questions in particular, 27 and 28, about willingness to serve in the United States military and forswearing any allegiance to the Japanese emperor, were confusing and divisive within the incarcerated communities. The answering of these two questions, yes, yes, or no, no, created rifts between families and friends with hostile and traumatic divisions that resonate to this day. In this story, Noda answered no to question 27, qualifying that before he would serve in the US military, he and his family should first be given their freedom. Consequently, Noda and his family were sent to Tule Lake, segregation prison. And in anger, Noda renounced his American citizenship. Ozawa, on the other hand, answered yes, and volunteered for military intelligence service to become an interpreter and a spy during the war. At the end of the war, Noda lives with an embittered sense of betrayal, while Ozawa returns from the terror of war, but can never reveal his secret work for military American intelligence. And this silence plays out in the rebellion of their Sensei children. This is a watercolor painting by the extraordinary artist Wendy Yoshimura. She was born in Manzanar Camp in 1943. At the end of the war, her parents renounced their citizenships and moved to Japan, returning to California a decade later. Wendy studied at the California College of Arts and Crafts, but she also became involved in underground political activism. She is famous for being arrested with Patty Hearst in 1975. She was convicted on explosive weapons charges, sent to prison for 6 months, and paroled in 1980. During her parole, she taught art at the San Francisco Japantown, and it is her unspoken story that underpins the character of Nora Noda, the general's daughter. Persuasion, as far as I'm concerned, is a pun. In the 60s, there was a singing group called the Asian Persuasions. They sang, danced, dressed, and did their routines like Smokey Robinson. Now they could have been these guys. Okay, in the day, they were much younger looking, but they are still pretty cute. Or they could be these guys. I don't know, you choose. My guess is that this guy could be my guy. The Elliott family in my persuasion is the Kikukatana family. No such Japanese surname exists. At least I don't think so. In 1946, as the war ended, anthropologist Ruth Benedict published the book Chrysanthemum and the Sword, Patterns of Japanese Culture, in which she compared the contradictions in Japanese society to the cultivated beauty of the chrysanthemum and the bloody violence of the sword. Chrysanthemum in Japanese is kiku, and the sword is katana. Therefore, kiku katana. I interpreted the the patriarch in Jane Austen's novel, Sir Walter Elliot, to be pretentiously covetous of his status as a baronet. Kiku katana is my way of playing with the contradictions and the pretensions that Benedict supposedly uncovered in Japanese culture. One more thing, these are the girls. My mother is seated down there at the bottom to the right. These ladies were known to my family as the girls. They were a group of unmarried aunties who always got together, and I imagine any three of them as moving in to raise the heroine of Persuasion, Anne, when her mother died. Mrs. Aka convened the girls. She called Mrs. Nendo, who called Mrs. Ekubo, and they all met in Marie Callender's for lunch. Mrs. Aka squeezed the sliver of lemon and stirred 2 lumps of sugar into her iced tea. We have, shall I say, a situation. Mrs. Nendo looked over her bifocals, querying, situation? And back to the menu. Oh, I can't decide, pot pie or pot roast? Michi, pot pie, you always do the pot pie, observed Mrs. Ekubo. Girls, Mrs. Aka interrupted, we have a situation. Her eyes drilled into her soul sisters as if this could be the Bay of Pigs. The last of Austen's novels is Lady Susan, and although I assume it was written first, my version of Lady Susan is titled Omaki-san. In the writing this story, I researched the writing of Ichio Higuchi. Higuchi can perhaps be considered the Jane Austen of Japan, and her image is on the 5,000 yen bill. She lived from 1812 to 1896 through the transition of the Edo period to the Meiji and the opening of Japan. Ichio Higuchi wrote this beautiful story, Dakekurabe, known in English as Growing Up or Child's Play. It is a story of children coming of age in the late Edo period in Tokyo. One of the characters is named Omaki. My story is set in the post-war years when a young Nisei doctor, James Yamazaki, went to Nagasaki to work with victims of the atomic bomb. He wrote his memoir in this book, Children of the Atomic Bomb. The story I've written has been created around the memory of this history, that encounter with Japan, both motherland and foreign country, involving Nisei doctors like James Yamazaki and many other Nisei interpreters and military intelligence officers who worked for the occupation in post-war Japan. As you know, Lady Susan is written in what we know as the first form of the novel, the epistolary, that is, letter correspondence between characters. Similarly, my Omaki-san is written in epistolary. In this case, letters are exchanged between Los Angeles and Nagasaki during post-war Japan. And I suppose you have to be able to read Japanese to know what is really happening. True intentions lie in the language and to whom the letters are written. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge my friend and the poet and translator, Keijiro Suga, who translated Omaki and Otsuma's letters into Japanese. Mukashi, Mukashi, the war came with planes and dropped bombs and destroyed everything. Not that the bombs were anonymous, nor were the men who piloted within, but from that distance in the sky, who could know where exactly the bombs fell? Would it have been different had the eyes of the child who pointed upward and those of the bombardier met? In this assumed indifference, many people died, but there were those who who crawled away from the rubble and found a way to survive. And there you have it, the story of how I came to know and appreciate Jane Austen, but also how in some form or other, all the heroines and heroes in Jane Austen's novels could be, well, Sensei. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation, and so many great images from the photos of your childhood, which thank you for providing us with, to the illustrations from your niece. Just all around wonderful.
Thank you.
Just a reminder to our audience, there's still time to stick some questions in the Q&A if you would like us to ask them. We will get to those, as many as we can tonight. So to begin with, the question that I want to ask is about adaptation. And, you gave us this wonderful story too of how you came to Jane Austen and all of these wonderful stories you told. And at the beginning, right, you listed some reasons people are drawn to Jane Austen. But what about Austen do you feel makes her so adaptable? The reason that you're able to take these stories and transpose them to different times and places and experiences.
I think the plot lines are familiar to us. And then the desire to think about how young women, come of age. And I think those stories, I think as young women, we all identify with, no matter what culture we live in. So, and then as my while the gowns my sister is making are, from the 17th to the 18th century, what centuries are we? 17th, yeah, that's right. The 18th to the 19th century. Somehow, she finds those stories, timeless. So yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. But I felt that I could figure out some ways to tweak the stories. No.
It did strike me how many women in your own life you intertwined into this presentation, which was just lovely to hear.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's very moving. Thank you so much, Karen. Jamie has a question in the audience. What was the most rewarding aspect of writing Sansei and Sensibility, and the most challenging?
I think the most challenging story, just to start with that, was Lady Susan. When I finally got to that story, I thought, I don't think I can find something comparable. I couldn't find a matching story, and but then I realized that it might be a transnational. That the story may actually be moving across the ocean between two homelands. And that's when I figured it out. I think the most rewarding was finally to have my sister acknowledge that the stories were better than she thought, or at least she liked them more than she, because in the beginning I would send her the letters and the stories, and she was just quiet. Or she would say to me on the phone, they're too subtle, no one will understand.
It's funny because the Sense and Sensibility, for example, some people argue that the relationship between the sisters is actually more important than the marriage. One of the final lines is about one of the best benefits being how close they lived to each other and how the husbands got along as well. What do you think about? Did you pay any attention to sisterhood versus marriage in your adaptation, since that was so obviously so close to your heart as well while you were writing?
Certainly, that first story, yes, the relationship with the sisters is important, and the one sister being more practical, and and the other, diving into her emotions. And, my sister says, "That's us." And for a while, I thought I was the older one. I was more, sensible, but actually, yeah, she made me realize that she's the person. I'm the emotional one of the two.
Okay, is it my turn?
Yes.
Okay. Is it okay if I ask a question? When I was reading Jane Austen novels, one of the most striking features was the description of food. A lot of the times,
Oh, really?
Jane Austen. Yeah, well, maybe because I read Maggie Lane's book about Jane Austen and food. Because, for example, there's a mention of mutton, and also I think there's in Pride and Prejudice, Austen compares Jane's thighs to meat. It's almost like saying, women are, commodities for men. And so when you were reading out today, you did mention sashimi. and in your version of Austen short stories, I find it fascinating because you do mention food many times, particularly in Emmy.
Okay, yes.
And
the teriyaki steak.
Yeah, and I think Austen was doing something like, okay, talking about food really reminds us that, to make a living, you've got to earn the money. It's all about the material wealth of people. And I guess Austen was quite conscious in representing food as such. And I don't know whether you did the same or you had another idea about the food, describing food. And you draw both cultures together, don't you? Not just Japanese food, but not just ramen, but all the other kinds of food. And that was really interesting for me. Could you kind of explain to us something about your consciousness about food and its representation?
Well, I like to cook. I cook a lot. My friends who know me know that that's what I do. So when I'm not writing, I'm either cleaning house or making making food, making dinner.
Oh, what kind of food? What kind of food?
All sorts of things. And I'm always trying new things. So food just sort of naturally gets worked into all my work, my fiction. I'm always concerned with it. But I think in these stories, we do have to talk about food because, maybe Japanese Americans don't always talk to each other, but they always come together with food. So potlucks, events in which we share food, the picnic food, which is particularly Japanese, so that you'd have to have rice balls and musubi and teriyaki sticks. I mean, those things that's part of our that's our picnic culture. And then I set that story that's about the Tama Cafe book. I call it Hiroshima Cafe, in this cafe in Little Tokyo. And I was particularly interested in what the diner food they were making, and that people actually loved to go to that place to have the chashu ramen. That was but it wasn't quite Japanese, but it was a Japanese version of. And their chop suey was also a Japanese version of a Chinese, China meshi is what we called it. Yeah.
Yeah. And
all those things are culturally the mix that was happening in those days. And I think it was important to share that.
Yeah. I mean, I really felt that. I mean, you even mentioned teriyaki sticks and strawberries together in one of the scenes in Emmy, and I actually made note of that when I was reading. I thought that was interesting. That is really
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That's funny that you would notice that.
We have someone who wants to know about how much of Austen literary criticism have you read and whether or not it informed the themes you stressed in your own stories.
No, I haven't read much. Or have I? The one thing I did read, and I read it before I read Jane Austen. I will cop to this. I read Edward Said's famous essay, and I thought that was very interesting. And my sister always says, "Oh, that's been debunked." You know, I've gone to Jane Austen things, and that's already been debunked. And I thought, wow, but it's a pretty good point. So I was very interested in that little peek into the wealth of these people, and that Jane Austen had, she knew, or she was citing it. So it also made me take a look at the slave trade of the period, and the building of Great Britain as an empire. All of those things are part of this story of great wealth and great new wealth. And so,
Yeah.
but I don't think that necessarily our time is so different. We're always having new groups of new wealth being created. Now it's probably the tech industry that's created great new wealth.
I thought that the way you adapted it was very clever into this new setting, still acknowledging, right, some of those systemic, disparities are still occurring.
Yeah, and one of the things that's happening, of course, in the post-war is that the Japanese American community, despite the fact that many of them have lost everything and they're coming back to their homes, they are, because they're in America, they're in positions of privilege, not necessarily wealth, but in many cases, they're better off than their families back in Japan. And so I was also trying to show those intersections. In the case of my family, a part of the family in Japan were very well-to-do, and they recuperated that status in the war years. But my grandparents in San Francisco had a grocery and fish market, and I know that my grandmother and my grandfather sent boxes and boxes of food constantly to Japan, to that family, to support the family. And when I visited Japan many years later, and I talked to my great aunt there, she said that her older sister, my grandmother, sent her boxes of baby food, and the bottles would come, and she would use one bottle every day for her new baby. And then it would come down to the last bottle, and she would wonder, what will we have to eat the next day? And she said, thankfully, another box would arrive from Tei Yamashita. So I never heard these stories. No one said that they'd done this. So I knew that there were there was this support between families. But also the war brought a devastation to Japan. And then despite the fact that we were, my parents, at least, they had jobs and they were able to sustain themselves. So we had a different situation. And then it's on the post-war, parts of our family from Japan would visit. And that interchange was very interesting. Not always easy, though.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, it seems like so much of of what you have written has to do with the silence of the generation before, and how little was expressed, how for various reasons, on different sides of the Pacific maybe, but it's just, I think silence is a really big theme in Austen as well. So I found that very moving, the way you talk about it. So that one of the Candy is asking, is there a source to see what literature might have been available to those Japanese who were held in the US war camps? Are there ledgers of like library materials, or was it just what each person brought? Do you have any insight into that? And she's hinting a little bit whether they read Austen, but just more generally as well.
I don't know. You know, I don't know how the libraries were stocked. My mother told me that she, and I don't think this was in Utah when she was at in Topaz, but when she was in Tanforan, which was sort of the what they call the assembly center, the transition space, she said that she was able to get from the Bancroft Library many books, and that they were sent to her at Tanforan, and she read them. And knowing my mother she was a Dickensian. She read all of Dickens. So if she was reading Dickens, there was someone reading Jane Austen for sure.
Thank you. Kimio, you're muted.
Sorry. There's a question related to camps, intern camps. I was also interested in this problem, or your way of looking at the experience of the past, because your parents may have withheld the historical facts about what happened to people, what happened to Japanese Americans. And I think you also mentioned in today's lecture that Northanger Abbey, you consciously extracted this Gothic element from it. And you actually kind of foregrounded this incarceration theme. And it was really interesting for me to hear about the loyalty questions. I mean, I've as a Japanese, I was really interested in the narratives of these people who experience. I've read many novels about these people's experience, but this person wants to know about this. How did the Japanese Americans put in camps and their children feel about the difference between their Japanese American situation and that of other sort of possibly German Americans, or immigrants from other parts of the world? And is there any kind of difference that you felt after hearing these stories? Or
well, certainly the comparison, or at least my feelings with my Jewish friends, and I understood what they were saying about the Holocaust and the death camps that their families, ran from or survived. And there's a very moving story about the segregated Japanese unit that was fighting in Europe. That in fact, they were the first to liberate one of the, I don't remember which camp it was, but which death camp in Europe it was. So there are stories about the survivors in the camp seeing these Japanese come in and wondering who were these people and who had won the war, right? Because they were being liberated by this Japanese, but they were Nisei. And then that when the official liberation of the camp was recorded by the newspapers, the Japanese were put away. They were sent away. So they're not in the official pictures. But in fact, many years later, both the men who had liberated the camp and the people, the Jews who had been liberated, they remembered each other and met to honor that moment. So these were things that we knew later that happened, but they were stories that were told later, much later. And then I know that in the case of Germans and Italians, there were not entire communities who were incarcerated in the war, but Italians and Germans were incarcerated, depending. And a friend of mine whose mother was Italian, but who did not have citizenship, she spent most of the war in some hotel somewhere with other Italian ladies who, so they were isolated and in prison, and they were not allowed to leave this place. I think it was a hotel. And but her father, who had American, papers, he was not forced to. He was not imprisoned in any way. And my friend said that it was harder on him than his mother. His mother actually, and she and all her friends went over to a hotel, and they finally got some free time during the war. They were sat around and knit and talked to each other. But indeed, these groups were, you can read about it, their experiences during the war. They were not trusted.
Wow, that's fascinating. Did you mean Sugihara Chune? You were talking about this Japanese guy who liberated Jewish?
No, Sugihara was was he an ambassador or a consulate? He was in Poland, I believe, at the time,
not Germany.
Yeah, he was not, I think. And then I forget what country he was in, but he stamped passport after passport after passport to allow the Jews to leave, and they gave them visas to Japan so they could leave. So that's what. No, I'm talking about either Dachau or one of the Jewish death camps that was liberated during the war, as the war was ending. And the first people to come in to secure the camp was this battalion of either the 442nd or the 100. It's a Japanese American segregated battalion.
Oh, wow.
So they were Nisei men, they were Americans who liberated the camp, but it was a strange encounter because all of these men, their families they're imprisoned in the United States.
And one of your characters was from that battalion, right? Which one was that? The 442nd that was.
Yeah, I think Darcy's father, he has a great deal of pride of being part of 442nd. So, yeah.
Thank you.
That's so many interesting ideas there and a lot of historiosity there. And the question in particular, being descendant of German Americans myself, my granddad, who was Jewish and who was a German speaker in the States at the time, he too felt the way to prove his Americanness was to join the service and to join the service as young and as quick as he could. And these stories just kind of make me think about the ways that we memorialize these histories in the stories that we write and all of the stories you've been telling us about tonight and the ways that they inform your writing. Generally, do you see your writing as a form of like memorialization, as a form of recording those histories in a quote unquote fiction format? Or how do you feel about that relationship between these pasts and these presents?
I think that, yes, that if I don't write about these stories, then they won't be remembered. So yes, a kind of memorialization, probably. Yeah, and since my parents are dead, and most of their generation is dying. My mom was, when she died, she was 90, almost 99. So, quite old. And so there's stories that will be lost unless we write about them. But I admit that Jane Austen is a weird place to put them, but
But you're not the only writer who does that. And I think that's something we've seen quite a bit over the course of our various series, is a lot of authors are, for whatever reason, drawn to Austen as a medium to express those histories. And I was just curious, would you say this is like a purposeful motive of your writing, or is it something like secondary that just crops up?
Well, no, first of all, it was for my sister. So then Austen, the stories were scaffolding for something that I could recognize as a story that I knew, but a scaffolding more, using the plot, using the characters and situations.
But in terms of the memorializing, it seems like you using Austen has brought this history to a huge number of audiences who otherwise wouldn't have heard about it, right? Didn't you say, I think I remember you saying in a different talk that your publishers or your friends told you that this would be a very popular book, partly because of Austen, right?
Yeah, I didn't believe anybody. I didn't care about that. That wasn't the reason why I wrote it. I didn't. It was, but now I realize that this is, unbeknownst to me, this has been a way to bring a history that's unknown to many people. Make it available. Although I spent a lot of time in this talk telling you these things, trying to help uncover it and to say, well, this is what's happening. But you can read it without knowing this. But I think it might,
Just to acknowledge another listener here. Cheryl was asking about No Boy, and whether in general, I think our listeners would love to hear what other kinds of literature you recommend reading if for people who are interested in this Japanese American history.
No Boy, very interesting. One of the earliest writings, and also one of the earliest writings really talks about the no, those two questions, the questionnaire, the loyalty questionnaire, the yes, no. And when Okada wrote this, I think he was really onto something really important, but it was such a divisive question within the community yet. I think that it was too raw and too on their minds, because people were alive yet who still had hurtful feelings, both on the no side and the yes side. The yes people felt that they had sent their children to war, that they had died for the United States, and that those who had been who had pleaded no for very just reasons. They were ostracized for not having joined the military and gone to prison instead, or renunciated their citizenship because they thought what had happened to them was wrong. So on both sides, there's reason, but between the two groups, there was conflict. And many people died with those feelings of, yeah. So no is really an interesting introduction to how these men who had claimed no and had said, look, get us out of prison and we will go to fight for you. What you're doing is wrong. They were, you know, this is a just, but people did not understand. And in No Boy, you see the protagonist really ostracized by his community and also controlled by his family. And that's a very revealing story, but it's one side of you know, that was, yeah, I would suggest. There are many histories written about this. There's Michi Wagland, who has written about the history of the lies that were told by the government and her uncovering of them. You know, I have to think right now about there are many history books though. My friend Jean Wakatsugi Houston wrote the book Return to Manzanar, and I think there was a film made many years ago about that. Julie Otska has written 2 beautiful books about, you know, this time period and about picture brides and also about the internment. Yeah, I suppose I can get like a list together, but I'm sure you can find it.
Maybe we can email that out to the listeners later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions, but that was just such a moving talk, and what a testament to sisterhood. I'm certain your sister must just be the proudest Janeite on the planet.
Or the most embarrassed.
Well, thank you again, and thank you to everyone in the audience today. Please stick around for just a few announcements about our upcoming program. We have one more program in this series before we break for the summer, and that is Jane Austen and the Buddha with Catherine Duncan, who is in the audience here today. I don't know if you're still there, Catherine, but if you are, say hi in the chat. She is going to be talking about her book that was just published last November on what we can learn about enlightenment from Jane Austen. So this is going to be a really great talk to learn about Buddhism and also to explore Jane Austen's philosophical side. And as always, you can sign up for free at janeaustenandco.org/sign-up. Jared, I'll hand things over to you.
Yes, and if you want to read more about Jane Austen, her life, afterlives, and adaptations, come check out the blog for the Jane Austen Summer Program or follow us on social media. JASP, the Jane Austen Summer Program, is a 4-day summer symposium that typically takes place in June in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. This year's theme is Austen and Shakespeare, and JASP will take place June 16th through 19th, 2022. So we will have our usual lectures, hands-on workshops, small discussion groups, exhibits, and other activities that blend scholarship with fandom. The event is currently full, but there is a wait list you can join, and you can do that and learn all about JASP at janeaustensummer.org.
And I'd like to just thank everybody who attended today. If you do, again, if you have ideas for what our next series should be, I think Anne and I plan to do one in the fall. Just drop us a note or put your idea in the chat, and we would encourage you also to do the poll at the bottom of your screen if you haven't already. Jared, can you tell us the results so far?
Yes, do I still have that window pulled up? No, so it is right now, it's sitting at 57% everyday science in the Regency, 43% authors Austen read.
Okay.
It's a close race.
Wow. Well, that might have to be
feels
booked.
We might have to combine the two somehow.
Yes.
Yeah, or do
Oh,
the science in the fall and the
Yeah, the authors in the spring.
and they're sliding now. People are voting as I speak, and it's already authors. Austen Reed is starting to catch up. So yes,
Okay.
throw your vote in. If you haven't, send us an email or a message, and I'm sure we'll have this poll again at the next lecture as well.
And this program was supported in part by the North Carolina Humanities, UNC's Humanities for the Public Good, and also UNC's Carolina Asia Center. We would like to thank all of them for supporting us. Please do consider making a gift to the Jane Austen Summer Program. We're a registered nonprofit, so your donations are tax deductible in the US. It'll help keep these events free and help us support the teacher scholarships and essay writing contests and the various things that, that we do for the public. And if you're looking for a great graduation present, little ampersand pendants are pretty nifty, and cufflinks to raise money for the Jane Austen and Company. So, but finally, thank you so much, Karen, for joining us, and
Thank you.
really enjoyed it. And thank you all, and stay safe, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you,
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everybody.
Thank
Stay
you.
well.